under the weight of the city's restless night, where rain traced silver veins across the pavement and neon signs pulsed like tired hearts. Alexander Grant walked with the same mechanical elegance that had carried him through boardrooms and banquets, though inside him nothing stirred but silence. His fortune was the kind that newspapers called legendary, the kind that turned him into a figure of envy and speculation. Yet behind the polished veneer, there remained an emptiness so profound that it gnawed at every hour he spent alone in the echoing mansion he called home. Infertility had been the cruel sentence delivered in sterile medical offices, and though he had shaken the hands of doctors and nodded as though it meant little, the truth was that every child's laughter on the street felt like glass cutting into his chest. His empire would endure. His name would be remembered in contracts and portfolios, but there would be no small voice calling him father, no legacy of warmth to soften the edges of his wealth. He had grown used to this loneliness, carrying it as one carries an old scar, until on that rain-drenched evening fate set before him a sight that fractured the numbness and stirred a pulse in the hollow place where hope had long been buried, under the weak flicker of a failing lamp at a deserted corner. A woman sat with her back pressed against the rough wall, her clothes soaked and clinging to her as if determined to pull her further into the cold. Her hair dripped, her hands trembled, and in her arms she cradled a bundle that whimpered with the raw voice of new life. Claire was her name, though to Alexander in that moment she was nothing but the fragile embodiment of survival, her eyes swollen from tears shed in battles far older than the storm. Beside her, a stroller leaned crooked, its wheel bent at an odd angle as if mocking her attempts to keep moving, and a plastic bag sagged with the weight of possessions too few to belong to anyone who had known safety. She bent her head close to the child's ear, whispering words that were lost to the night, but her posture spoke louder than any sound. She was pleading not with a man, nor with the city, but with the universe itself, begging it not to strip away the last fragment of light left in her arms. Alexander had walked past countless beggars, had seen suffering through tinted car windows, always cushioned by the armor of distance and wealth. Charity was something delegated to accountants and publicists, clean, convenient, a gesture that could be measured and filed. But what struck him now was not poverty alone. It was the sight of a woman holding on to dignity by a thread, refusing to let despair pry her hands from the child she sheltered against her chest. The baby's cry rose in the damp air, mingling with the rumble of distant thunder, and in that cry Alexander heard an echo of all he had lost before he ever had it, the echo of the child he could never cradle. His steps slowed, and with each pace forward he felt a weight pressing against him, the awareness that one choice, a gesture or a word, might alter not just their night, but the entire architecture of his life. Claire looked up when the shine of his shoes entered her blurred vision, and suspicion hardened her face at once, the reflex of someone who had been failed too many times by men who promised much and delivered little. She drew the baby closer to her chest, her body tightening like a shield, and turned her gaze away, readying herself for mockery, for dismissal, for the cold indifference of another wealthy stranger. Alexander stopped a step away, studying her not with the gaze of a man evaluating a transaction, but with the searching eyes of someone who recognized a wound that mirrored his own. He saw the pride in her jaw, the quiet defiance in her trembling posture, and though she had nothing, she carried a strength that no sum of money could buy. The silence between them stretched, heavy and electric, until broken by the child's thin wail, sharp enough to pierce both their guarded hearts. Claire shifted uneasily, trying to hush the baby, her voice a hoarse whisper, almost an apology for disturbing the night. Alexander found himself kneeling before he even decided to, the wet ground soaking his tailored trousers, his hand hovering in hesitation, not daring to reach for the child yet unwilling to withdraw. He had faced rival billionaires, hostile takeovers, and the unforgiving eye of the press, yet never had he felt as vulnerable as he did beneath the gaze of a woman who clearly had every reason not to trust him. Rain gathered at the tips of his hair, sliding down his face, but Alexander barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the fragile curve of the infant's cheek, On the way, tiny fingers clenched at the blanket with the stubbornness of life itself. Something inside him cracked open, a reservoir of longing he had buried under years of resignation. And in that instant he wanted nothing more than to protect, to provide, to lift both mother and child out of the storm, into a world where fear could no longer reach them. Yet he knew that to speak too soon, to move too quickly, would only drive them farther from him, for trust could not be purchased and mercy could not be forced. Claire's lips parted, perhaps to warn him away, perhaps to ask what he wanted, but no words came. Only the tremor of exhaustion and the sharp rise and fall of her chest as she struggled to steady her breath. Alexander finally found his voice, low and deliberate, stripped of the authority that usually clung to it. He asked if they were safe, if there was somewhere she could go, and the question hung between them like a fragile offering. She gave no answer, only a glance that carried more stories than a lifetime could contain, a glance that told him of nights spent without shelter, of promises broken, of the relentless battle to remain standing. The world around them moved as if detached, cars passing in the distance, lights blinking in indifferent rhythm, while here at this broken corner time seemed to halt, suspending three souls in the fragile balance of possibility. Alexander felt the storm of his own heart echo the storm in the sky, a clash between fear of rejection and the pull of a destiny he did not yet understand. The choice was no longer about philanthropy or pity. It was about the undeniable recognition that the woman before him and the child she held had been placed in his path not by chance, but by a design larger than either of them could see. And so, without yet knowing what words or actions would follow, Alexander remained there in the rain, close enough to feel the fragile heat of a baby's breath, close enough to sense the walls of a woman who had been forced to be stronger than she ever wished to be. And in the quiet space between thunder and heartbeat, the story of their entangled fates began to take root. The storm outside Alexander's mansion had not ceased when he finally brought Claire and the baby across the marble threshold, though inside the house the silence was almost unbearable, as if every corner echoed with the absence that had always haunted him. The entrance hall stretched wide, its chandeliers glowing dimly, the polished floor reflecting the damp outlines of their arrival. And in that grandeur Claire felt smaller than ever, a misplaced figure of fragility among portraits of men she did not know, staircases that spiraled upward as if to heights she could never reach, and walls that seemed too heavy to belong to a home. She clutched her child closer, her arms tightening instinctively, and her eyes darted across the cold magnificence as though it might suddenly swallow her whole. Alexander watched her unease, the stiffness in her movements, the disbelief that she had stepped from a broken street into a palace, and for the first time he noticed how little warmth his fortune had built around him. He had designed this place to command respect, to display power, but in her presence it felt hollow, like a museum of loneliness. She did not ask for food, nor a bed, nor comfort. She asked only for permission to sit on the floor with her baby until morning, her voice trembling not from fear of him, but from the crushing weight of being indebted to no one, of refusing to beg even in the midst of desperation. Alexander found himself staring at her as though she were an apparition, something raw and unpolished that had slipped into his world of polished lies. And the more he observed, the more he realized she did not fit the mold of a helpless stranger. There was a resilience in the way she sat, shoulders squared even in exhaustion, chin lifted though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, a defiance that seemed to challenge the very architecture around her. He poured a glass of water with his own hands, something he rarely did, and set it beside her. And when she finally accepted it, with a whispered thank you, he understood that what sat before him was not charity, but a woman who had clawed her way through abandonment, who had carried her child against the current of every rejection, and who had not yet given permission for hope to collapse. That silent strength reminded him of boardroom battles, of the ferocity required to protect what one loves, and for a fleeting moment he envied the child who, though wrapped in poverty, was still wrapped in love. He saw in her posture a mirror of his own fight against the verdict of infertility, a fight waged behind closed doors, beneath tailored suits, in quiet consultations that ended with sealed envelopes declaring his lineage broken. Both bore wounds invisible to the world, wounds that had carved into their identities like chisels into stone, leaving scars that could never be erased. Claire's past, though unspoken in detail that night, rose like shadows from her silence, shaping the outline of her existence in ways that Alexander could sense even without words. She had known abandonment from the father of her child, the man who vanished when responsibility outweighed desire, leaving her with bills she could not pay, with promises that shattered like cheap glass against reality. She had known hunger not just in her stomach but in her soul, the hunger for a hand that never reached back, for a voice that never returned her calls, for stability that crumbled whenever she thought it might last. And yet she carried herself with the pride of one who would rather sleep on the street than surrender the dignity of being the sole protector of her child. Her world had been one of fleeting jobs, of rooms rented by the week, of people who looked through her as though she were transparent, a nuisance to be endured rather than a life to be valued. Each detail of that struggle clung to her like the rain still drying on her skin, and Alexander, though wealthy beyond measure, recognized in her a kind of richness he had never possessed, the richness of purpose, the absolute certainty of what she was living for. His own history surfaced in counterpoint, a symphony of absence rather than loss, for he had never been left behind by a lover or starved by circumstance, but he had been denied the one experience he longed for most, the inheritance of fatherhood. Doctors had spoken of probabilities, percentages, cold figures that reduced him to a file, and every time he left those consultations, the world outside seemed to mock him with children darting across sidewalks, with fathers swinging their daughters in parks, with mothers smiling at infants in strollers. He had built companies, funded charities, bought art and property, but none of it silenced the gnawing truth that his name, though engraved in marble, would not be carried by any voice of his own blood. The loneliness was not only in his bed or in the echo of his footsteps across his estate. It was in the hollow space of knowing that all his victories would die with him. And so when he saw Claire clutching her child with the ferocity of a mother who had lost everything else, he felt a pull stronger than pity, a longing that was not about saving her but about glimpsing, through her, a life he had been barred from entering. The baby, small and restless in her arms, became the silent center of their collision, the fragile thread tying their vastly different worlds together. Alexander studied the child with an intensity that startled him, the curve of tiny fingers, the rhythmic rise and fall of breath, the way innocence seemed to shine even through tears. He wondered what it would feel like to be looked at with those eyes every morning, to hear the sound of laughter not as an echo from strangers, but as music born from his own walls. Claire, noticing his gaze, shifted uneasily, a mixture of fear and protectiveness flaring across her features. For she knew too well the cruelty of a world where men might covet what was not theirs, where generosity might conceal intentions sharp as blades. Yet Alexander did not reach forward, did not speak promises. He only sat near enough to share the silence, and in that restraint she saw something different. Not hunger, not pity, but recognition. Recognition of pain, of longing, of the heavy weight of unfulfilled dreams. The house itself seemed to listen as night deepened, its corridors no longer proud but hushed, as though curious about the intrusion of life into its cold geometry. Servants moved quietly in distant rooms, confused whispers exchanged, for it was rare that their employer brought anyone inside, rarer still that he showed such attentiveness to a stranger who arrived soaked and shivering. Yet Alexander ignored their glances, focused entirely on the fragile presence before him, determined not to let judgment intrude upon what he instinctively knew was fragile ground. Claire's pride was her shield, and he understood that to strip it away would be to lose her trust forever. Instead he offered small gestures, a blanket folded carefully across the arm of the chair, a soft word about the guest room prepared upstairs, the assurance that no one would disturb her or the baby. She resisted at first, shaking her head, insisting she would not stay, that she only needed shelter for a few hours until dawn. But exhaustion betrayed her strength, and eventually she allowed herself to be guided, not as a guest of wealth, but as a mother too weary to continue fighting the night. As she settled the baby on the wide bed, the child curled instinctively into the warmth of the covers, a sigh escaping lips too young to form words. And in that moment Claire's own body softened, surrendering to the fatigue she had carried like armor. Alexander remained at the doorway, watching silently, aware that he was intruding upon something sacred, yet unable to look away. He had seen masterpieces hung in galleries, performances that drew applause from thousands, but nothing compared to the quiet poetry of a mother bending over her child, tucking the blanket with careful hands, whispering promises only the child could hear. He felt the sting of tears threaten at the corners of his eyes, an unfamiliar weakness for a man accustomed to commanding empires, and he turned his face away, ashamed and grateful all at once. The night stretched long, yet neither of them truly slept. Claire dozed lightly, waking at every movement of her child, her dreams haunted by fears of being forced back onto the street, of losing the small stability that this moment of refuge provided. Alexander sat in his study, unable to focus on the reports and figures that usually occupied his restless hours. He thought of his own father, stern and unyielding, a man who measured worth by numbers and achievements, who had once told Alexander that children were distractions, liabilities to be avoided. That memory twisted in his chest, for now he saw the lie of it, the barren wasteland that such logic had built. He understood with painful clarity that all his victories had been shadows cast by the light of something he never attained. And that light had just entered his house in the form of a trembling woman and her child. By dawn, Alexander stood at the window watching the city awaken, and he felt something shift within him, subtle yet undeniable, as though the weight he had carried for years had met its counterpart in the weight Claire carried. They were strangers bound by scars, by longing, by the silent witness of a child who had slept through the night's uncertainties. He knew that when she woke, when she gathered her things and prepared to leave, the choice would be his, to let her walk back into the chaos from which he had rescued her, or to step into a role he had never imagined possible. And though he did not yet have the courage to name it, he felt destiny tightening its grip, pulling him toward a decision that would change the course of all their lives. The morning that followed was heavy not only with the residue of the storm, but with the unspoken questions hanging between Alexander and Claire. When she awoke, the baby still pressed safely against her. Sunlight streamed through tall windows draped with velvet, casting long golden stripes across the unfamiliar room. For a moment she did not remember where she was, her body tensing with the instinct to flee, her hand clutching at the bundle beside her as if someone might take him away. Then memory returned in fragments. The rain, the corner, the man in the dark coat who had extended not pity but presence, the marble floors beneath her tired feet. She rose quickly, almost guiltily, and began to gather her few belongings, her movements urgent, restless, the reflex of someone who had been thrown from places before, who had learned that generosity often carried hidden costs. Alexander, standing at the threshold with his usual stillness, watched as she tried to fold the blanket back neatly, as though leaving no trace of herself would somehow erase the debt. He did not stop her, did not command her to stay, though every part of him wanted to. Instead, he let silence stretch between them until she finally turned, her eyes wary, her voice caught between gratitude and defiance, as she whispered that she should go, that she had already taken too much. Alexander had faced hostile investors who demanded millions, journalists who dug for weaknesses, rivals who wielded threats dressed as contracts, yet never had he felt the sting of helplessness, as he did in that moment, when a woman, fragile and fierce all at once, insisted on leaving the safety he could provide. He asked her where she would go, not as a master interrogating a subordinate, but as a man stripped of all power except the desperation in his voice. Claire did not answer directly. She only lifted her chin, a silent declaration that she had survived worse nights and would continue to do so. The baby stirred, his small cry slicing through the tension, and Alexander felt the sound reverberate in his chest like a demand he could not ignore. Against his usual instinct to control, he stepped aside, opening the doorway with the gentleness of surrender. But when Claire crossed into the city again, her figure swallowed by the restless movement of streets already alive with workers and vendors, something inside him snapped like glass under sudden weight. He could not return to the old silence, not after hearing that cry in his own house. Hours later, fate tightened the thread again. Alexander was in his car, the tinted glass shielding him from the world as usual, when he saw her once more, not by design, but by some cruel orchestration of life. She stood outside a grocery store, her face pale with humiliation, as a clerk gestured angrily, pushing her away while onlookers shook their heads. A loaf of bread fell to the pavement, soaked instantly by a puddle, and the baby's wail rose higher, piercing through traffic, through Alexander's guarded exterior, through the armor of years. He signaled the driver to stop before thought could intervene, and stepped out into the noise of honking horns, his presence drawing stares as always, though this time he cared nothing for the spectacle. Claire's eyes widened when she saw him, suspicion and pride flashing like lightning. But before she could speak, before the crowd could mutter further accusations, Alexander bent, picked up the bread, brushed the dirt from it with deliberate hands, and pressed it back into her grip as though he were restoring not food, but dignity itself. The crowd did not remain silent. Murmurs rose, sharp with judgment, their voices weaving a net of accusation that neither wealth nor motherhood could easily escape. To them, it looked like a transaction, a spectacle of a wealthy man rescuing a fragile woman for motives too obvious and too old to need repeating. Whispers of opportunism, of scandal, of impropriety cut the air, but Alexander did not flinch. His gaze, unwavering, met Claire's, and though her eyes burned with the humiliation of being the center of such scrutiny, she also saw in his expression something steady, something that refused to exploit her weakness. He did not raise his voice to silence the crowd, did not wield his power like a weapon, but simply stood beside her, as though his very presence declared that she was not alone. That quiet defiance unsettled the onlookers more than any shouted defense could have, for it contradicted the narrative they were eager to believe. Claire's heart pounded with conflicting fires. Shame at being seen through the lens of gossip, rage at the unfairness of it, fear that he too would turn his back once the cost of her presence grew heavier than convenience. Yet the baby's cries demanded more than pride could offer, and she, though unwilling to admit it, felt relief at the bread in her hands, at the quiet shield of his stance beside her. She whispered for him to leave, her voice sharp with urgency, warning him that his reputation would rot if he lingered too long in her shadow. But Alexander only shook his head slowly, as though reputation had already lost its grip on him. For years his image had been built on control, on perfection sculpted into every headline, but here, in the chaos of a street where a child wept and a mother trembled, he discovered that authenticity required the risk of scandal. He did not care for the photographs already being taken, nor for the gossip that would slither through news feeds before dusk. What mattered was the trembling weight in Claire's arms, the fragile human bond that had stepped into his life uninvited and now refused to be ignored. It was not until the police arrived, summoned by some restless witness eager to report theft or disturbance, that Alexander's resolve was truly tested. The officer, young and dismissive, looked at Claire with the cold indifference of someone accustomed to categorizing lives into boxes of guilt and innocence before hearing a word spoken. He demanded identification, questioned her ability to provide for her child, and hinted darkly at social services, at investigations that might pry the baby from her arms under the pretense of protection. Claire's face drained of color, her hands tightening around her child as though she could hold him beyond the reach of law itself. And in that moment, before she could even respond, Alexander stepped forward, his voice steady, carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. He declared her under his protection, his responsibility, his guest, and when the officer raised an eyebrow at the name he spoke, recognition flickered instantly, softening hostility into nervous deference. The crowd shifted uneasily, some muttering retreat, for money may not buy everything, but it could silence accusations faster than any plea. Claire's pride battled with gratitude until it broke into quiet tears, tears she despised but could not hold back. As the officer apologized stiffly and departed, leaving her dignity bruised but intact, she turned on Alexander with fury, whispering through clenched teeth that she had not asked for his rescue, that she would not be paraded as another of his conquests, but he met her anger with a calmness that disarmed her more than kindness ever could. He told her that he did not see her as weak, that he did not intend to purchase her compliance with bread or shelter, that he only recognized in her struggle something that reminded him of his own. She wanted to deny it, to spit back words that would wound, but the baby stirred against her chest, sighing into her collarbone, with the kind of trust that children grant without hesitation, and she realized her fury could not erase the truth of what had just transpired. He had chosen to stand with her when the world pressed to strip her of everything. By the time they returned to his car, the crowd dispersing, the city swallowing the scene as it always did, Claire felt both heavier and lighter. He had seen her at her most humiliated, had heard the whispers, had watched the officer's threats, and yet he had not retreated. That terrified her more than cruelty would have. For cruelty she could fight, indifference she could endure, but constancy was a danger she did not know how to resist. Alexander sat opposite her in the car, silent, his gaze not pressing her for words, not demanding gratitude. And in that silence she found herself trembling not from cold, but from the fragile beginning of trust. She told herself it was temporary, that by tomorrow she would leave again, that she would not let her child grow attached to a stranger whose world was built of glass and gold. Yet as the car moved through the city, carrying them once again toward the mansion, she could not silence the part of her that whispered of safety, of possibility, of the faint hope that destiny might be rewriting itself in ways she could not yet admit. And so the day ended as it had begun, not with resolution, but with uncertainty sharpened into hope, the kind of hope that frightened as much as it healed. Alexander had risked his name, his image, to defend a woman and child who owed him nothing, and Claire, though determined to resist the pull of his protection, could not deny the truth. He had been there when no one else had, and that kind of presence, rare and uncalculated, carried a power greater than fortune. Neither spoke of what would come next, yet both carried the weight of unspoken decisions, their paths entwining not by choice, but by a force that felt larger than both. The rescue was only the beginning, and in the quiet of their shared silence, the question that neither dared voice lingered like a heartbeat in the air. What would this unlikely bond demand of them tomorrow? The days that followed were not marked by smooth adaptation, but by a storm of misunderstandings, silences heavy as stone, and the subtle clashes that arise when two worlds so vastly different are forced to share the same fragile space. Alexander's mansion, with its polished corridors and staff that moved like shadows, seemed like a gilded prison to Claire, who had spent years accustomed to freedom even in poverty, to making choices guided only by survival. Here, every gesture felt like surveillance, every kindness like a transaction she could not afford. She mistrusted the way servants lowered their eyes around her, whispering in corners, their voices carrying judgments about the woman who had walked in with the master of the house, a baby pressed to her chest. She mistrusted Alexander himself, his silence too calm, his generosity too deliberate, as though each act of provision concealed an expectation she would never be able to repay. Yet beneath her suspicion burned gratitude she could not deny, gratitude that unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. For cruelty she had learned to fight, but kindness asked her to lower her guard, and that was a danger far greater than hunger. Alexander, in turn, found himself navigating territory more treacherous than any financial gamble he had ever made. He had expected resistance, perhaps even temporary defiance, but he had not expected the way Claire's pride would strike at him like a blade every time he tried to ease her burdens. When he arranged for new clothes, she refused to wear them, keeping instead to her weather-beaten jacket, as though fabric could tether her to the dignity of endurance. When he asked the chef to prepare meals fit for a banquet, she ate sparingly, her eyes sharp with the suspicion that he was fattening her into dependence. He was accustomed to transactions where value was measured, to partnerships negotiated with precision. But this was something else entirely. A bond that could only grow through trust, and trust was the one currency his wealth could not buy. Each refusal struck him not with anger but with shame, a reminder that he had spent his life commanding obedience. Yet here stood a woman who would rather sleep on the street again than bend under the weight of obligation. The baby, unaware of the battles fought in silence around him, became the fragile thread binding them in ways neither admitted. His cries filled the house with a sound that was at once disruptive and healing, echoing through halls that had never known the laughter of a child. Servants frowned, unused to the intrusion of such fragile life into their routines, but Alexander found himself drawn to the nursery more than to his boardroom, pausing in the middle of contracts to listen for the baby's breath, to watch the way Claire soothed him with hands that trembled from exhaustion, yet never faltered in their care. It was through the child that Alexander and Claire spoke when words failed them. When he offered a toy, she accepted it not for herself, but for the tiny fingers that clutched at it. When she allowed him to hold the baby for the first time, her eyes lingered not on him, but on the way the infant rested against his chest, as though weighing whether the man could be trusted not by his words, but by the ease of a child's sleep in his arms. Yet the outside world, relentless and hungry for spectacle, did not grant them the privacy to navigate these fragile beginnings. Rumors had already spread, woven by those who had seen Alexander in the street defending Claire, magnified by tabloids eager to feast on the scandal of a billionaire and a mysterious mother. Headlines speculated, photographs appeared, and the whispers became daggers. She was called an opportunist, a schemer, a woman who had trapped him with the convenient presence of a child. Claire read the words on crumpled pages with eyes that burned, clutching the baby tighter as though the judgment of strangers might somehow rip him away. She confronted Alexander with fury, accusing him of dragging her into a spectacle she had never asked for, of turning her survival into gossip fodder. He, though wounded by her words, did not defend himself. Instead, he admitted the truth, that it was his fault the world looked at her this way, that by standing with her in public he had painted a target on her back. His honesty, stripped of excuses, disarmed her anger, though pride forced her to look away before he could see the sting of reluctant trust blooming in her silence. Inside the house, their friction grew more intimate, sharper not with cruelty but with the endless push and pull of boundaries unspoken. She hated the way he hovered when she cooked something simple, as though he had never seen a pan used outside a chef's command. He hated the way she insisted on cleaning her own space, scrubbing floors that had never known her touch before, her movements sharp with defiance, as though each sweep of her hand was a declaration that she owed him nothing. Arguments flared in whispers, not to wake the baby, over details so small they revealed the vast gulf between them. Whether the window should be opened to let in air, whether lights should burn late into the night, whether she could leave the house without security trailing behind. Neither yielded easily, for both were scarred by lives that had taught them survival meant control, and giving control to another felt like stepping willingly into a fire. And yet, beneath the quarrels, something fragile began to stir, something both feared to name. When she laughed once, unexpectedly, at the baby's clumsy attempt to grasp Alexander's tie, he felt the sound reverberate through him like music in a hall that had been silent too long. When he returned late one evening to find her asleep in a chair, the child curled in her arms, the lamplight soft on her face, he stood there for a long time, unwilling to break the fragile picture of peace, realizing that home was not marble or chandeliers, but the quiet rhythm of breath shared in sleep. They never spoke of these moments, never acknowledged them, for to do so would risk shattering the fragile trust still forming. Yet each carried the memory like an ember, hidden but glowing, proof that the clash between them was not destruction, but the grinding friction from which something new might emerge. The baby grew stronger under the roof that had once echoed only with silence, his cries sharper, his laughter louder, until even the servants began to soften, their whispers less cruel, their eyes less guarded. They too felt the change in the air, though none dared speak of it, for the presence of life in the mansion altered its weight, transforming grandeur into something that resembled, however faintly, a home. Claire still bristled at their glances, still carried her pride like a shield, but in rare moments she allowed herself to breathe, to place the baby in Alexander's arms and step outside into the garden alone, to feel the air on her face without fear of losing everything in an instant. Those moments were short, fleeting, and she never admitted their importance, but Alexander noticed, storing each sign of her trust like treasure, each small concession proof that her walls, though high, were not impenetrable. Still, the world outside sharpened its knives, determined not to let their fragile equilibrium remain untouched. Invitations arrived from society events, inquiries from journalists pretending at innocence, subtle pressures, reminding Alexander that his place in the public eye could not be separated from the choices he made within his home. Claire refused to attend, refused to be paraded, and her refusal deepened the whispers of scandal. He did not force her, did not plead, but every time he stood in a room filled with glittering eyes and empty words, he felt the absence of her presence heavier than the chandeliers above. And when he returned home, tired of masks, he found himself seeking the sound of her voice, even if it was sharp with reproach, because it was honest, unvarnished, a voice that cut through the fog of his world with clarity. By the end of that first month together, their trust was still fragile, easily fractured, but it existed, woven through clashes and reconciliations, through silences and unspoken recognitions. They had not yet admitted need, had not yet spoken words of permanence, but in the rhythm of days and nights, they had carved out a space where survival was no longer solitary. Alexander no longer lived in a house of silence, and Claire no longer walked streets without shelter. They did not yet call it family, did not yet call it love, but the truth, undeniable and growing, was that their lives had begun to entwine, not with the gentleness of fate's mercy, but with the harsh, grinding force of two storms colliding. It happened not in the silence of a private conversation, but in the full glare of an audience that had gathered to witness something entirely different. Alexander had been summoned to an event he could not easily refuse, a charity gala held in the heart of the city, where every wealthy name carried weight and every camera fed the public's hunger. He arrived with Claire at his side, though she had resisted until the last moment, her jaw set in defiance, her body tense as though walking into an ambush. She wore a simple dress, one chosen with hesitation, and carried the baby as though he were both shield and vulnerability. Whispers rippled through the hall the instant they appeared, the kind of whispers that clung like smoke, muttering judgments, spinning stories before truth could even draw breath. Claire felt the sting of those eyes, sharp and dissecting, and she wanted nothing more than to flee. But Alexander's hand rested lightly against her back, steady, firm, not pressing but promising that she would not face this storm alone. The speeches began, the music swelled, and when the moment came for Alexander to speak, no one expected the words that would fall from his lips, words that shattered the thin layer of civility in the room like glass beneath sudden weight. He did not speak of profits, nor of his usual commitments to hospitals or schools, nor of the investments that built his empire. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Claire and the child she held, and with a voice that carried through the hall without strain, he declared that in them he had found something greater than wealth, something he had long been denied, something that no empire could replace. He spoke of the emptiness of years without heirs, of the silence that had haunted his mansion, of the laughter he had heard for the first time echoing not in memory, but within his own walls. And then he said it, the words that froze every eye, every glass raised mid-air. He would raise this child as his own, not as charity, not as spectacle, but as a declaration that blood did not define family, that love did. For a man like Alexander Grant, whose image had been carved in stone and guarded like treasure, it was a confession and a vow, laid bare before those who thrived on scandal. The silence that followed was not reverence but shock, disbelief, the heavy pause before the storm. Claire's heart pounded as though it would tear through her chest. She had not been asked, had not been prepared, and now her name, her child, her life were thrust into the light of judgment she had spent her years trying to escape. She wanted to scream, to drag him from the stage, to tell him that family could not be declared like a business acquisition. Yet as she looked into his eyes, she saw not calculation, but raw truth. He was offering not protection for a night, nor charity for a season, but permanence. And permanence terrified her more than hunger ever had. The audience erupted, half in murmurs of awe, half in whispers of suspicion, their words slicing through her resolve. Opportunist, manipulator, gold digger. She felt the names as though they were brands searing her skin, and though Alexander stood tall, unflinching, she could not stop the flood of humiliation rising in her throat. For every step he took closer to her, declaring his choice, she felt the ground beneath her crack, as though the weight of his promise might crush her. Reporters rushed the stage after, questions flung like daggers, cameras flashing, their voices demanding explanations, demanding proof. Claire shielded the baby's face, her hands trembling, her body curving around him as though the lights themselves were weapons. Alexander's arm encircled her, but even his presence could not soften the roar of speculation. That night, the headlines spread faster than the rain that had once soaked her clothes. Billionaire declares stranger's baby his heir. Photographs showed her eyes wide with shock, her posture defensive, her mouth tight with fear. No article captured the truth of her trembling silence. The way she whispered to her son in the car afterward, promising him that she would never let the world use him as spectacle. Alexander sat beside her, silent, his own words replaying in his mind, the weight of their consequences pressing heavier with every mile back to the mansion. At home, the confrontation erupted. Claire's voice shook with fury as she accused him of stealing her choice, of binding her to him without consent, of turning her into a pawn in his defiance against loneliness. Her words cut deep, each syllable sharper than any insult he had endured from rivals, for they were not the accusations of strangers, but the cry of someone who had been forced into a battle she had not agreed to fight. Alexander listened, his face drawn, his defenses stripped, and when she demanded to know why he had done it, he answered with the truth that had driven him for years. He was tired of emptiness, tired of silence, and when he looked at her child he saw not charity but destiny. He did not ask her forgiveness, did not beg her to stay, but simply admitted that the words had been born of a longing too strong to remain caged. She wept then, not for him but for herself, for the cruel realization that she had begun to believe him, and believing was the most dangerous thing of all. The following days brought no peace. The media camped outside, vultures circling, their questions turning sharper with each unanswered hour. Claire could not leave the house without being followed, could not step into the garden without lenses tracking her every movement. She held her child tighter than ever, her body stiff with the constant weight of scrutiny, and each time she glanced at Alexander, she saw not just the man who had offered her safety, but the man who had also bound her to a storm she could not escape. And yet, she also saw the way he bore the criticism himself, never shifting blame, never distancing himself from her even when it might have been easier. He stood beside her through every headline, through every rumor, though his presence only fueled the fire. The mansion, once a fortress of solitude, had become a prison of light, where privacy was a luxury they could no longer afford. Then came the betrayal, sharp and sudden from a place she had feared but had not expected to wound so deeply. A letter arrived, slipped through the press of envelopes, bearing a signature that froze her blood. The name of the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. Inside was no plea for forgiveness, no attempt at reconciliation, but a threat to expose her past, her debts, her desperation, to reveal every scar she had fought to keep hidden. Unless she severed ties with Alexander and returned to the life she had been clawing her way free of. The words dripped with venom, painting her as a liar, a manipulator, warning that the world would believe him before it believed her. Claire crumpled the paper in her hands, her heart pounding, her breath shallow, the weight of humiliation threatening to suffocate her. She had survived abandonment, hunger, judgment, but betrayal always cut the deepest when it came from a face once trusted. She did not tell Alexander immediately. Shame, that old companion, tightened its grip, whispering that perhaps the world was right. Perhaps she was the opportunist they claimed. Perhaps her very presence was a stain on his life. She withdrew into silence, her eyes shadowed, her voice brittle, and he noticed, of course he noticed, though she deflected his questions with the practiced evasions of someone who had learned to hide pain like a secret wound. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and when Alexander discovered the letter, found it torn but not destroyed, his fury was not directed at her, but at the coward who had dared to threaten her. His promise was swift and fierce, that no past betrayal, no lurking shadow would tear from her the dignity she had fought so hard to keep. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of loss, the fear of repeating old cycles gnawed at her resolve, leaving her trembling between trust and retreat. The betrayal became the mirror through which both of them saw the fragility of their bond. For Alexander, it revealed the depth of his own commitment, that he would fight not only for her present, but against the ghosts of her past. For Claire, it revealed the risk of belief, the risk of letting someone else stand in battles she had always fought alone. They clashed again, not with anger this time, but with the desperate confusion of two souls torn between fear and longing. She begged him to release her, to let her leave before the storm destroyed them both, but he refused, not out of control, but out of conviction. He told her that destiny was not a chain but a choice, and his choice had already been made. She wept then, not in fury but in surrender, though surrender did not yet mean peace. And so, the declaration that had been meant as a promise of life became entangled with the shadow of betrayal, binding them tighter even as it threatened to tear them apart. The mansion echoed with voices that rose and fell, with silences heavy as judgment, with the restless cries of a child who did not yet know he was at the center of a storm that could alter the course of many lives. For Alexander, the path forward was clear though perilous, to prove that his vow was not spectacle, but truth. For Claire, the path was darker, tangled with memories of pain, of abandonment, of wounds that refused to heal. They stood together at the edge of uncertainty, not yet broken, not yet whole, knowing only that the storm had not finished with them, and that the next trial would demand more than words, more than promises. It would demand everything. The storm of betrayal lingered in the air like smoke after fire, refusing to dissipate, clinging to every breath inside Alexander's mansion. Claire carried the letter's poison in her chest, each word etched deeper than the last, whispering that she was unworthy of safety, unworthy of the fragile stability she had begun to taste. She walked the halls as though pursued by shadows, her eyes scanning for judgment in every servant's glance, her body tense with the old reflexes of survival. She remembered too well what it meant to be abandoned, to be stripped of dignity, to be left with only a baby's cries for comfort in the cold. And now, with Alexander's vow echoing across the city, she feared the same pattern would repeat, only this time the fall would be from heights too great, the humiliation too vast. She told herself that leaving would be mercy, that tearing herself from his life would protect them both from the ruin her past threatened to unleash. Yet when she looked at her son, his tiny hand gripping hers with unrelenting trust, she faltered. How could she give him back to a world that had only ever taken? Alexander saw her unraveling, though she tried to mask it behind the brittle shell of composure. He noticed the way she avoided his gaze, the way her voice thinned to whispers, the way she lingered near doors as though preparing to flee. For a man who had mastered reading markets, who could sense a shift in percentages before others caught the scent, it was not difficult to read the tremors of her heart. But unlike numbers, unlike negotiations, this was not something he could control with precision. His usual tools, contracts, wealth, influence, were useless against the fear carved into her bones. He knew instinctively that pressing too hard would drive her away, yet letting her slip silently into despair was unthinkable. And so he began to move not as a businessman, but as a man stripped bare, choosing honesty where calculation once lived. He told her of his own fear, of the shame that had stalked him for years, of the weight of knowing he would never hold a child of his own blood. He confessed that her child had broken through his armor not as a replacement, but as a miracle he had never dared hope for. His words, unpolished, trembled with something she had never expected from him: vulnerability. It was the baby who became their anchor, the fragile reminder that fear could not be the compass of every decision. One evening, as thunder rolled again in the distance, Claire found Alexander in the nursery, the child resting against his chest, both asleep in the chair by the window. She stood in the doorway, her breath caught, watching the rise and fall of the baby's small body against the man she had accused of stealing her choice. There was no spectacle here, no audience, no declaration, only a man holding a child with the quiet desperation of someone who knew what it meant to be denied this intimacy. The sight broke something in her, shattered the brittle wall she had rebuilt after the letter, and though fear still roared in her veins, she stepped into the room, knelt beside them, and for the first time laid her hand gently over Alexander's. His eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to something softer, and in that silence she spoke the words she had resisted. "I am afraid, but I don't want to run anymore." From that moment, the battles they fought began to change shape. The arguments did not vanish, the mistrust did not dissolve overnight, but the core of their conflict shifted from resistance to navigation, from retreat to fragile partnership. Claire allowed him to stand beside her when reporters called her names, no longer snapping at him to disappear. Alexander, in turn, began to listen when she spoke of independence, of the need to earn her own path rather than be sheltered like glass. He offered her space rather than smothering protection, and in return she began to accept the gestures she once rejected. When he provided clothes, she wore them, not as a debt, but as recognition that dignity did not mean deprivation. When he spoke of security, she agreed, not because she wanted surveillance, but because she finally believed his intent was not control, but care. Each concession was small, delicate, yet each one carried the weight of oceans, for in them lay the slow, painstaking construction of trust. The world outside, however, did not relent. Reporters pressed harder, rumors multiplied, and the man from her past sharpened his threats, spreading lies in places where truth rarely survived. Claire trembled under the pressure, yet each time she threatened to leave, Alexander's response was the same. He would not let fear dictate their choices. "If we let them decide for us," he said, "then we are already defeated." His conviction did not erase her fear, but it steadied her when her knees threatened to buckle. And slowly she began to believe that perhaps survival did not always mean retreat. The child, blissfully unaware of the wars waged around him, grew louder in his laughter, stronger in his steps, a living reminder that life insisted on pushing forward even when shadows threatened to smother it. His presence became their shield, their proof that hope was not just illusion, but flesh and breath and heartbeat. Still, the confrontation with her past could not be avoided forever. The threats grew bolder, the lies sharper, until Alexander insisted they face them head-on. Claire resisted, afraid that dragging the past into the light would only magnify her shame. But he told her that love demanded truth, that hiding would only give power to those who thrived in darkness. When the confrontation came, it was fierce and public, her betrayers spewing venom, Alexander standing unyielding, and Claire trembling on the edge of collapse. Yet when the choice came to retreat or to stand, she found herself lifting her chin, her voice cracking but steady as she declared that she would not be defined by the man who abandoned her. The world listened, divided as always, some jeering, some applauding. But for the first time Claire felt the chains of fear loosen, not because the world believed her, but because she had chosen to believe herself. That night, after the dust had settled, Alexander found her in the garden, the moonlight painting silver across her face. She confessed that fear still lived in her, that it would never leave completely, that every kindness from him still triggered the suspicion of a debt she could not repay. He listened without interruption, without defense, and when she finished, he did not argue, did not promise a future without shadows. He only said that love was not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep walking through it. The simplicity of the words struck her harder than any vow, and though she did not reply, her silence was no longer defiance, but acceptance. She allowed him to draw her close, her head resting against his chest, the sound of his heartbeat mingling with the steady breath of their child asleep inside. And in that moment she understood that survival was no longer her only destiny. Living was. The weeks that followed were quieter, but heavier, filled with the slow weaving of two wounded lives into something resembling family. They shared meals without tension, walked the gardens without distance, learned to speak without barbed words. The baby's laughter filled corners that had never known joy, and even the servants began to soften, their suspicion replaced by a reluctant respect. For Claire, each day was both victory and risk, for each step deeper into this fragile trust made the possibility of loss sharper. For Alexander, each day was revelation, proof that love was not an empire to be built, but a seed to be tended, fragile, demanding, yet more valuable than anything he had ever purchased. Their bond was not sealed by declarations, nor by wealth, nor even by the vows of a stage, but by the steady choice, day after day, to remain in the presence of fear and still reach for one another. By the time autumn painted the city in gold and fire, the mansion no longer felt like a prison of stone, but like the fragile outline of a home. The storms had not ceased, the world had not silenced its whispers, the past had not dissolved, but within those walls, a man once broken by infertility, and a woman once crushed by abandonment, had begun to choose not survival, not retreat, but love. And though they did not yet speak the word aloud, both knew that the choice they made each day was rewriting the destiny that had once seemed carved in stone. The winter came quietly, though not without its tests, wrapping the city in breath that lingered white in the air and blanketing Alexander's estate in silence, broken only by the crunch of footsteps on frost. Inside the mansion, however, the silence no longer reigned supreme. It had been pierced, broken, reshaped into something warmer. The halls, once echoing with the hollow weight of wealth, now carried softer sounds. The baby's laughter tumbling like bells, Claire's voice humming lullabies in the late hours, Alexander's footsteps no longer lonely but joined by others that traced paths alongside his. To outsiders, the scandal still clung like smoke. The newspapers still whispered opportunism. The gossip still circled with sharp teeth. Yet within those walls another truth was being written. Claire found herself astonished each morning at the sight of safety that had not been ripped away in the night, at the simple consistency of food on the table, of warmth in her child's cheeks, of hands, Alexander's hands, that did not vanish when storms threatened. She had lived her life braced for loss, trained to retreat before disappointment struck, and now the steady rhythm of presence unsettled her, as much as it healed her. But as days folded into weeks and weeks into months, she began to understand that love was not a promise of safety, but the decision to remain. Again and again, even when fear whispered its cruelest warnings, for Alexander, the transformation was no less staggering. The man who had once hidden behind empires, who had buried longing beneath steel and glass, now found himself kneeling on nursery floors, crawling with a child who squealed at the simple miracle of play. He discovered in himself a patience he had never believed possible, a gentleness he had once mistaken for weakness, a joy that defied the calculations of profit and loss. The baby's small arms wrapped around his neck carried more weight than any signature he had ever penned, and Claire's hesitant smile, offered like a fragile gift after days of silence, held more value than all the accolades he had collected in gilded frames. Infertility had once been his cage, the verdict that had sentenced him to a legacy of emptiness. But now he understood that fatherhood was not defined by blood but by presence, by the willingness to stand, to hold, to protect. The wound had not disappeared. It would always ache in quiet corners, but it no longer defined him. It had been reshaped into something redemptive, something that gave him a place not as a figure on magazine covers but as a man in the heart of a family. The reconciliation between Alexander and Claire did not come in a single dramatic gesture, but in the accumulation of small moments, each one a thread, weaving them closer until the fabric was undeniable. It came in the night Claire woke screaming from a dream of abandonment, only to find him beside her, silent, steady, refusing to let her fight shadows alone. It came in the mornings when she left notes on his desk, brief words of gratitude scribbled on torn paper, reminders that though she still bristled with pride, she was learning to trust. It came in arguments too, the sharp clashes that left them both raw, only to be followed by apologies, by the recognition that love was not the absence of conflict, but the choice to return to one another after. And most of all, it came in the child's growth. His first steps taken not toward marble pillars or gilded portraits, but into their outstretched arms, his laughter spilling into rooms that had never been designed for joy but now existed for nothing else. In those moments the weight of the past did not vanish, but it no longer chained them. It became the soil from which something new had grown. Outside, the world eventually tired of the scandal. New headlines rose, new stories demanded attention, and the relentless hunger of gossip turned elsewhere. What remained, long after the noise faded, was the quiet resilience of a family that had been born not from ease but from fracture, not from perfect beginnings, but from wounds stitched together with faith. Claire, once the woman who sat shivering beneath a street lamp with nothing but her child, now walked the halls with her head higher, her steps surer, not because wealth had transformed her, but because love had reminded her she was not alone. Alexander, once the man who believed himself cursed to silence, now woke each day to the sound of a child's voice, calling not his name, but his place. Father. Together they carried scars that would never fully fade, but those scars no longer marked them as broken. They marked them as human, as survivors, as people who had chosen to fight not against one another, but alongside. And in that choice lay a redemption greater than any empire, greater than any headline, greater than fear itself. On a morning like any other, beneath a sky brushed with pale light, the three of them stood together at the threshold of the mansion, no longer master and guest, no longer rescuer and rescued, but family. The child laughed, reaching upward, his small hands clutching at air until Alexander lifted him high, his laughter mingling with the sound of Claire's quiet joy. For the first time, Alexander felt the word destiny not as burden but as gift, not as something carved by forces beyond him, but as something chosen, day after day, in love. Claire, watching them, understood that the life she had feared to believe in was no longer a fragile illusion, but a living truth, one that had survived storms, betrayal, and doubt. And in that moment, framed by the simple grace of an ordinary day, their story, born from pain, stood not as a tragedy, but as a testament that even the most wounded hearts can build a home, that even the deepest scars can be reshaped into love, and that sometimes the family destiny denies us is the very family destiny leads us to create.